Good afternoon and welcome to Wing UK's Wednesday with Wing. We're delighted today to introduce to you some fantastic work going on at the University of Leeds, which in fact was my alma mater, so I'm very proud to also produce this, although I wasn't involved in any of the work. And today we're going to learn about what Geosolutions Leeds do together. So they bring together a combined expertise of geoscientists, social scientists, engineers from across the faculties of environment engineering and physical sciences to deliver a multidisciplinary approach to the energy transition across a range of environments, including geothermal energy for heat, cooling and storage. So as always with these Wednesdays with Wing, please do engage, please do write any questions or even your thanks at the end of the talk into the chat box. We also have a Q&A box as well, which I will be monitoring in the background and answering. Hopefully we'll answer at the end when we come back to the Q&A session at the end. We also record these, so please be aware of that, but also we will distribute these at the end. It may be some time. We've got a bit of a backlog from over the last few years. But without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Emma Brampton, who will introduce everybody in the team. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Ollie. Thanks for giving us this platform to be able to talk to a wider group of people. My name's Emma Bramham, and you can't see everybody else because we're all sitting in the same room, so we're going to move it around as we go through the talk. So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about the geothermal work we're doing here at Leeds, or some of the geothermal work we're doing here at Leeds, that impacts not just the university but the wider Leeds urban environment and hopefully the wider UK. And in true sort of nature of the fact that we're doing sort of very hopefully non-siloed collaborative work, there's three of us doing the talk today, not just me. So there's myself and there's Jessica Ryan-Smith and Arka Duty Sarkar will also be talking for a portion of the talk. So so that's quickly introducing those two as well. So my part of the talk, I'm going to be focused on looking at the work we're currently doing on campus. So we're currently in the middle of a drilling project to look at making our campus geothermal and using geothermal energy. And I'm the academic lead for that project. So the actual campus project, it's on the academic side, has a good number of us working on it. We have two postdocs, David Barnes, who comes from the social science side of the project, and Arka, who will be talking later, who is on the geoscience side of the project. We've also had a research assistant for a period of time who we've now successfully converted to doing a PhD, who's also still working alongside us and will be using some of the data long term that we have in the geothermal campus living lab setup that we have. On the academic side of the team, there's myself and Nick Shaw, who I think is on this call, and Richard Collier, amongst others, working on the geoscience side. In the engineering side, there's Fleur Loveridge and Simon Rees, and on the social science side, it's Frim Bale and Jamie Van Alstyne. And I say amongst others because whilst we've been lucky enough to be the academic team specifically working on this project, there's a much wider group of people at Leeds who are involved and will be getting involved as we get more of the data comes online and we start sort of trying to analyse and work with the data we've got. So the Geothermal Campus as a project, hopefully you can see this on your screens. We've got the two main focuses, social science and geoscience focus. So I'll just talk you through both of those aspects and how they sort of meet in the middle. But you can see right in the middle in bold writing, one of our main aims is to university decision making for 2030 and beyond. So at the moment we're in a test phase for geothermal, and I'll talk through that a little bit more in a minute. And there'll be more decision making to make whether we adopt geothermal on a much wider scale across campus going on beyond 2030. So part of the aims of this project is to get enough information to help guide those university decisions successfully. So from a geoscience side, we started a year or so ago with guiding initial decision making around what to put on campus, where to put the test site. That included looking at analysis of Ellenflad's aquifer, bringing together legacy data, so borehole data, map data, any geophysical data that's available, And we also looked at field analogies. Now, Alka is going to talk a lot more about those later, so I won't get into the details about those. And we built some very initial campus cross sections that allowed us to look at the campus in more detail than the average engineering consultant would at that stage, at sort of a feasibility stage. And that allowed us to guide where we should be drilling, where an appropriate test site would be. We are currently moving on into looking at modelling that, static modelling, dynamic modelling the aquifer across a range of scenarios, looking at synthetic data, actual data, etc., and building some dynamic models of how that reservoir behaves in the aquifer underneath campus. From a social science focus, so David, our PDRA, is very much along the governance and political sort of focus, so working very closely with Leeds City Council, understanding where barriers to impacting uptake for geothermal energy, how we can change that as a system, working with the council, but also looking at the communication side. So we've had the opportunity with the work we're doing on campus to watch our community of 40,000 people respond to that drilling work on campus, respond to the questions they're asking, the worries that they have, and allowing us to sort of build up a portfolio that of communications, and how we as geoscientists, who historically haven't been very good at communicating, can communicate better about what's going on under the ground. So there's a lot of work going on the social science side as well. They will move forward to look at things like developing economic business models and templates for geothermal that can be then passed out to the wider, not just the Leeds urban environment, but wider Yorkshire when it pertains to this particular aquifer, but actually the research that we've got ongoing behind it can be sort of hopefully helpful across many aquifers across the UK. So you can see at the end of this stage, you can see those things coming together where the geoscience effectively acts as evidence to be able to state a case for geothermal and geothermal uptake. So a starting place for us was understanding the potential energy centres, so where we could have focused arrays potentially of geothermal energy in different areas of the campus. So for those that haven't been to Leeds campus, it's very urban, it's really quite central in the Leeds city urban environment, but it's also the size of a small town. It's a really big area, and so effectively we're looking at multiple geothermal solutions, not just one single geothermal solution that's fit for all the different areas of the university. So for instance, we might have areas that need a lot of cooling around the medical and bio buildings that need lots of cooling in the summer versus data center areas, and all sorts of different needs, different types of buildings. So an original feasibility study looked at the university and designated different potential energy centres and different types of geothermal solutions. So you can see on the figure on the right hand side, hopefully you can make out purple lines. They roughly align with the brighter blue lines in the left hand side. So they represent a steam network. So currently the university is heated, if you see the red box at the bottom with GSC on it, that actually is our heat generating complex that's shared with a hospital south of the campus. And that produces steam at a pretty high temperature that's then pushed through the steam network. So you're looking at pushing that around this sort of really large network of ducts all the way up to the top of campus. So hopefully you can see my arrow. Let me just move it to the right screen. There we go. So an area, so for example, up here, we call this the engineering cluster. So all the main engineering buildings is a long, long way away from the heat generating complex. And as such, that's a really perfect part of the campus to maybe take off first from the steam complex. So the idea will be for the university that over time we'll take all the buildings gradually off that steam network and remove the need to have that gas generated heat at all on campus. So following on from that's sort of been the main focus, and the university's plan for the engineering cluster was to potentially use a mix of energy sources, but predominantly air source heat pumps, which in its turn provides issues with increased electrification. So the university agreed to fund setting up a test site for geothermal that was associated with the engineering cluster. So in line with that, we developed originally 2D cross sections through campus, various 2D cross sections. And just to get your eye in here, we call this Western Campus, and actually the area that we've got the test site sits. Oh, I'm not on the right screen. Sorry, I've got multiple screens up here. So the area that we've got the test site sits in this area here, and we've chosen this because it sits to the side of this fault area and presents a laterally continuous area, or what we hope to be a laterally continuous area of the aquifer. So we can actually test for the aquifer and how the aquifer behaves without the complexity of adding in additional issues with faults, impermeability, potential impermeability, fracture and fault damage zones around the fault, etc. So another area, just to get your eye in on this as well, is this the second test site that we've got actually sits here, and we've deliberately chosen that to hopefully cut through a fault zone so that we can start to understand a little bit more about that fault damage zone. Because obviously you can see, if you know you're good at looking at cross sections, you'll have noticed a number of faults that lie across campus, and these could present compartmentalization. So that's something that we're really interested in exploring and understanding the impact of those faults in these reservoirs. Also to note that within this, we brought together lots of legacy data, and you can see lots of boreholes, quite shallow boreholes. There's a slightly deeper borehole here. You can see that's the School of Earth and Environment. So you see it says C at the top. And that was drilled in 2008, 2009, when we had one of the new School of Earth and Environment buildings built. And it was drilled at the request of the School of Earth and Environment because we quite fancied the idea of using geothermal energy to heat our new building. So we duly drilled and tested, and there was really good flow rates, which hinted at potential for geothermal. However, at the time, the university made the decision to not pursue geothermal energy because energy was cheap at the time, and it was a better decision to just put us all on the steam network. So obviously we have that data, which has been useful, and you'll see a much deeper borehole across here, which is further into Leeds. It's legacy data that we're able to get access to. And you'll note down here, you can see this red the layer down here, which hints at the potential for us to also be able to access the rough rock aquifer. And as such, our drilling test sites in some of the holes have gone down to 250 meters, so we can actually investigate not just the Ellen Flags aquifer that sit these sort of yellow structures here are the Ellen Flag aquifer, but also assess the potential for the rough rock aquifer as well as a potential geothermal source of storage and heating for the university. So just very quickly about the living lab test sites that we have set up. You'll see in this diagram, so this is the engineering cluster up here. For anybody that knows Leeds campus, these are the Henry Price halls of residence, and this is Hyde Park over here. We have 2 open loop wells that are drilled to 150 meters. Our aquifer sits at around 60 to 90 meters, about 30 meters thick, in both of these open loop wells. We also have here 3 closed wells, so where you see the red circle with the cross in it, they're closed loop wells that have been initially had full thermal testing, and they are fully kitted out with optical fibers for thermal and acoustic sensors, so DTS and DAS sensors that will allow us to monitor heat long term, but also the potential for us to do things like vertical seismic profiling using the acoustic sensor, optical fibers down those closed loops. They are all also drilled to 150 meters. And you'll also see this pilot well here. So the pilot well was for us to get more geophysical and geological data. That is drilled down to 250 meters. We actually now have 2 pilot wells because of engineering issues. We have 2 pilot wells there now, one that will allow us to monitor the rough rock at around 230 to 250, and then the first pilot well will be sealed from 150 down and will allow us to monitor the top 150 meters in line with the open loop wells. Those pilot wells, so both the pilot well in this first test site and the pilot well down here by our building in Earth and Environment, have full core. So we've got around 500 meters of core that we are in the process of starting to assess. Alongside full geophys, so we had a whole load of geophysics acquired, including optical and acoustic televiewers, so that we can use the particularly the optical data to align the fracture networks, which we feel are important in the Ellen Flags. They're very directional fractures that we've observed in the Ellen Flags, and actually understanding the orientation of those fractures could be important for us selecting suitable geothermal doublets in the future. So that's something we were very keen to have in place. The pilot wells, all of these will be accessible by us, some of them fully kitted out already. The pilot wells will allow us, big enough to allow us to put geophys equipment down whenever we want to, both for research but also for teaching, so we can train students to use it, etc. So just some quick schematics of sorry, my mouse is going all over the place. There we go. So just as a quick schematic, because I talked longer about that slide than I planned to, but I think I probably explained this diagram quite well. So you can see that we've got it set up deliberately so that we have thermal boreholes on the outside of the reservoir, but also in between the two open loop wells. And that will allow us to monitor the thermal heat plume, regardless of which direction we're going in. So if we're extracting heat, understanding how that heat is moving in the subsurface, but if we're re-injecting heat and storing heat down there, then actually it will allow us to monitor both directions and help us to fully understand how that reservoir behaves, how we can put negative pressure in the system to pull the heat into our reservoir, etc., etc. So I think that probably covers everything. Oh, the other thing to recognise is the open loops are both reversible, so it will allow us to mess around with that system a little bit. And yeah, a quick schematic of that reservoir and the depths we're going to and what we're going to be looking at. Pilot, so test site 2 is much more investigative. It will allow us to actually look to see what the aquifer looks like down across a couple of faults. So understanding whether there's continuity in behaviour, whether there's any connectivity. It's quite a distance away, so even without the faults, maybe there wouldn't be connectivity. But it also is allowing us to look at the potential for a closed loop system underneath the halls of residence in that area. So instead of having open loop systems that we have at test site 1, we're investigating the potential also to have extensive closed loop systems in an area underneath some large halls of residence to provide heat to them. The other aspect is core analysis. So we have a lot of different labs at Leeds that will allow us to test the heck out of our core. We have a number of labs that we have until next February. We have to find somewhere else to store the core after that, but it will allow us to do full stratigraphic and fracture analysis of the core, and also link in the geophysics that we have with the core and sort of really start to understand what that geophysics is telling us. We'll also be doing lots of samples, so we'll be using the electron microscopy, the Cohen lab and the Wilson lab on site at Leeds to be able to do a lot of testing and fluid flow, thermal conductivity testing, etc. So before I pass over to the other guys, just to say that actually what we're doing is just an example, and actually an example of what this project has spawned. Obviously, we've been quite quiet about the work we've been doing at Leeds, and we're now starting to shout about it a bit. Hopefully, people are starting to hear about what's going on. But actually, behind the scenes, we've been doing a lot of work with particularly LCC stands for Leeds City Council, and then there's DESNES, which is Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and we have 2 offshoot policy projects currently in action that Jess is going to talk about more in a little while. And one is really to look at understanding we have a fairly new and innovative pipes network called Leeds Pipes in Leeds. So it's about 26 kilometres of heat network piping, currently heated by burning our waste. And that's sort of gas-centric burning of our waste. Obviously not the optimal way to heat that network. So we're currently investigating the potential for geothermal to not only feed that sort of pipes network, but also to think about how that network could be expanded using thermal energy as partial heat source for that network. The other aspect is looking at the heat network zoning. So Leeds is a pilot city for heat network zones, and sorry, my brain just completely stopped then. Yes, so what we're doing is working with Leeds City Council again, looking at some of the network zones that they've defined as potential for optimal use for heat network zones in the urban environment. And we've picked a number of those zones to assess what geothermal potential there is below the ground that could fit in with the social need for that network and that heat. And again, Jess is going to talk about that in more detail. So no further from me, I'm going to pass over to Arka to talk about modelling the geothermal reservoir.
Thanks, Emma. Right. So I'm the geoscience postdoc on the team. So I primarily work with subsurface analysis, and Jess will present the surface level analysis after me. So I think a good point to start is just this sort of example of best practice workflow for a geothermal exploration project. The key thing for us over here is to essentially look at the stages in the steps in stage 2 from the point of view of a geoscientist. What I'll draw your attention to is the fact that in an urban environment like we have for the Leeds University campus, the geophysical fieldwork is pretty much a non-starter. So that already for that aspect of it, we're going to have to look for proxies. But the sort of geological fieldwork, that can be something that is possible and that has been done. And then at the end of the Gantt chart, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that the conceptual model, that's something that you build pretty much throughout the process, and it's something that's continually iteratively updated as you do other bits of work around your overall project. So before we go into building a model, it's important to understand why we're doing it. What is this model going to help us resolve? So we can best do that by trying to think of what the key questions are with our campus project. So as Emma alluded to before, our primary target aquifer is the Ellen Flags Formation. It's a coal measure sandstone that occurs across the Leeds area. And another thing that you might have noticed in the maps earlier is that there's a high degree of faulting across Leeds and across campus in particular. So you can immediately start to see that when it comes to the flow of water within the subsurface, we're having to factor in what impact the fractures and faults can have in terms of pathways, fluid flow pathways. Then, if we're wanting to think about aquifer thermal energy storage, so ATES, for this project, we have to think about how over the lifetime of the system, that heat plume below campus is going to behave. And then the examples over there, it's essentially just showing what impact you could have from basically just changing just one of the parameters. So whether the fractures are open or closed, making them binary, for example. But yeah, all of this feeds into basically what we would like to think of is essentially a circular economy of heat, because we want to manage the aquifer under campus in a responsible way where we don't only take out heat, we also try and manage the heat recharge in the aquifer over time. So all of these questions will hopefully we'll be better able to resolve them through our modeling processes. So what does the best practice workflow look like when we sort of plot it out for our campus project? This is what it looks like, but I'd like to draw your attention essentially to the highlighted bit. And that's where we can basically simplify our modeling to a forward modeling problem, where we're taking our sort of initial starting point data, whatever that may be, and we're using it to create a geomodel of the subsurface. And what we want to do is forward model to basically try and match up what we're getting from the drilling stage. So all the data that comes in post the drilling, we want our forward model to match up with that so that we can best define what's happening in the subsurface. So again, with our sort of starting point, here's an example of that sort of campus geomodel. You can see that the typical sort of data sets that form the baseline, that the open source data sets might be your geological mapping data from the BGS geoindex, any sort of legacy borehole data, or any seismic data you have. So in this case, you've got the UK Onshore Geophysical Library. While there isn't seismic data running across Leeds University campus, what we have been able to do in another project is basically use the seismic data that sort of ring fences or exists in a donut, we call it the seismic donut, around our campus. We can use that to basically extrapolate inwards from there to help build out our initial starting block model. While we're thinking of data that we can use to better build that initial starting model, a good place to think is what can we access prior to drilling? And that's where the field work really comes in. So in the case of our project, when it comes to sort of qualifying and quantifying the properties within the Ellen Flags aquifer, we essentially need to understand how the stratigraphy works, so where it sits in the succession, what the architecture is of that particular unit, what its lateral continuity is, what we can expect it to be across the campus, because at this stage we're only testing at the top end of campus, but presumably when we run the other phases in other parts of the campus, will it behave the same way? So then we can start to think about where we can go nearby to get some of this information. And then I'd also like to point out that, again, with the drilling data, that is a 1D data set because you're only getting point data along the borehole track. Whereas with a quarry, for example, or any field outcrop data, you're starting to draw out sort of the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional spatial relationships as well. With our outcrop work, essentially, if we remember the cross-section shown earlier, the units in this area predominantly dip to the southeast. So we're able to go up dip, essentially, and find out where we have outcrops of the Ellen Flags. In Bradford, Halifax, and Pudsey, for example. So we went to a number of these quarries. And the reason we selected these is because if you can look at the inset maps, you can see that each of them slightly differs in the sense that in one of the quarries, there's no fault running through it. In another one, it's just adjacent to one of the faults. So we can expect to get an idea of how extensive the damage zone might be. And another one, we have a fault running directly through the quarry itself. So again, we're starting to be able to draw relationships, the spatial relationships on the larger scale structures from here. So in terms of the outputs from the fieldwork, on the right, you have our sedimentary log. So we were able to log the succession, see how the Ellen Flags fits in within the coal measures and with the underlying units and overlying units as well. It helps us understand the reservoir architecture. And then in the field, when we came across sort of channel structures and bed forms, they can also start to give us an understanding of what the paleo environment might have been. Also, while in the quarries, we're able to see how extensive any sort of interbedding is. So in this case, we had a set of thin mudstone interbeds, which we could see acted as barriers to flow in terms of water pooling out from under it or over it, but never through it. Also, we can see that those sort of interbeds act as baffles in the sense that the jointing that we see in the outcrop they tend to be strata bound within those sort of the sandstone packages separated by those mudstone interleaves. So again, you're starting to get an idea of the sort of internal compartmentalization of our aquifer from what we see in the quarries. And then in terms of the fractures themselves, we're able to see that if you look in the lower left, that there's two broad trends in terms of the direction of the two sets of major jointing, and that's roughly consistent with what we see with the faults across the area. Looking at the Ellen flags, at least at outcrop and hand specimen scale, it becomes apparent that, you know, it's a very densely compacted arcosic sandstone. It's unlikely that we're going to get much matrix porosity. Thus, we become reliant on the fracture network to provide our effective porosity and permeability. So then it becomes important to characterize that fracture network. So you can see here in the panel E, and we're starting to do trace out those fracture networks. And in future, we can start, we can think about photogrammetry data to start building discrete fracture network models. So we get the sort of 3D spatial variation of those fracture networks as well as, of course, the fracture spacing, the average fracture spacing, for example. In terms of stepping back to assess the workflow, the static model at the start, which I showed earlier, is essentially the sort of launching point where we're taking whatever open source data set we have prior to even putting a drill bit on the ground. So the sort of desktop study stage. That essentially will feed into that will underpin all the other modeling work that's being done concurrently right now. So basically, as doing the drilling on campus and data is coming in various forms from the campus drilling, we can use that to input into our dynamic model and iteratively update that with sort of real-time data from the drilling itself. And then over the course of the lifetime of the system on campus, we can get the time series data, for example, for the DTS, the fiber optics, and feed that into sort of longer term models of the subsurface under campus as well. So to better refine how well our modeling work can capture those sort of real life trends that we get from the well instrumentation, the idea is that essentially that static model, you're essentially history matching it against the results you get from the boreholes to see how well that process works. And then it's important to think about the scalability of the data that we're getting. So from the core, for example, we can get core plugs and thin sections, which will give us grain scale data, which we can then upscale into any of these sort of conceptual models. And then we have the quarry data, which gives us an idea of our reservoir scale. For example, conveniently, one of the quarry faces was about the right distance between our two water wells in terms of its lateral extent. So you can almost use it as a pseudo cross-section for the aquifer. So that gives you an idea how you can use the quarry data as a reservoir scale proxy. And then all of this then feeds into the wider regional scale sort of mapping and modeling that we'll see feeds into the work that Jess is doing and Mo Giza has been doing. In terms of the static model on the left, just want to show how we've got these well prognosis sheets. So essentially with the static model, if you can see my mouse over here, we basically create synthetic core sections from synthetic boreholes. And then what we can see is once we start getting the core data coming in, we can start to match some of the formation tops, see how well they match up with what we predicted or worked out from good old-fashioned sort of cross sections. And we can start to see certain trends. So, for example, we can see a zone of poor recovery at the top of the aquifer, and then there's flush loss coinciding with that. This is also what we saw in the quarries, with the units immediately above the Ellen flags fracture formation being highly fractured. So it's validating what we're seeing in the field with what we predicted in our sort of starting model or conceptual model, and then what we're seeing come in terms of raw data. And then finally, in terms of the sort of dynamic model inputs, there's obviously the core data, so you can get much more granular sort of information in terms of those interbeds, so any sort of baffling that might exist within our aquifer. Then there's the wireline logging data, so any sonic data, you can then start thinking about inverting that to get porosity or other properties that way. And then the pump testing, for example, again, that's another way where you can start to see validation between your sort of conceptual models, in the sense that in one of our water wells, we saw a high degree of flush loss, which coincided with the fact that that was the one where we expected and encountered a high degree of fracturing. And then with the pump testing itself, we see there's correspondingly a much higher flow rate through that particular well, sort of validating our theory that it's fracture-dominated flow. And then finally, we've got our thermal response tests and our fiber optics, both of which will be coupled together to give both bulk thermal properties for the subsurface, as well as giving, from the DTS, being able to derive sort of real-time data, much more granular spatial resolution down the well track as well. And then, yeah, all of this, again, not only does it feed into just campus geomodel, but it also feeds into the wider Leeds region models. And that's what I'll hand off to Jess to discuss with the surface level analysis. Oh,
there we go.
That's not
Moving IT around. Ready? So I'm going to ask you, well, change gears for starters and talk to you about social science, governance, and business models for local and regional geothermal energy use. But I'm going to start off with asking you all to put in the chat what you think the carbon emissions that come from our homes and buildings are in the UK. Any guesses? And some typing.
Is that percentage-wise?
Oh yeah, sorry, percentage-wise rather than okay, cool. Got a couple. Give the last couple people 10 seconds. Okay. You're all like not too far off, I would say. Close, but so actually in the UK, let me just click, there we go. About 1/5 of our carbon emissions can be attributed to heating our homes and buildings. Now, this number is, it's actually quite high in terms of percentage, and this is due to the low uptake of low and zero carbon heating solutions. So, for example, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, the majority of our homes are actually still heated by fossil fuels or through fossil fuels like gas boilers. So this can have significant carbon implications, especially longer term if we don't actually transition away. So the UK government is committed to decarbonizing the electricity grid with the idea that if heating is electrified, then it will naturally decarbonize as the grid decarbonizes. But there are lots of challenges to this, which Emma alluded to earlier as well. Big one is, so if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, that red squiggly line at the bottom is daily electricity demand. And as you can see, it's pretty steady through the year. But in contrast, the blue is actually the gas demand, and it has these big seasonal peaks and troughs. And if we were to switch all of our heating just to electricity, we would have some serious challenges meeting that demand. And that's not even taking into account the additional kind of demand that will be on the grid for things like transport and infrastructure as that electrifies. So really, in short, we need all of the energy that we can get to try to help with this transition. In terms of what that actually looks like in the UK, we are looking at a range of solutions. So you will maybe have across air source heat pumps and green hydrogen in the news, because those are the most talked about at the moment. And again, as Emma alluded to earlier, like air source heat pumps aren't necessarily the best solution for urban environments in particular, due to things such as space requirements and noise pollution. And that's in addition to the fact that they are very power hungry. They still require more energy, even though they are getting more energy efficient. So that can have implications for our grid overall. On the green hydrogen side, that has many, many challenges. And I would say probably one of the most significant ones for grid stability is the amount of energy that is required to actually produce a single kilowatt of energy. Highly recommend looking up the difference between wind energy versus producing green hydrogen within wind energy. But in short, it's now widely accepted that it's not really going to be the widespread solution for home heating. So that brings us to what else we could do. So the government mainly sees that we'll be decarbonizing through air source heat pumps for larger homes with outside space and heat networks in denser urban areas. Now, the particular advantage of heat networks is that they can enable us to use local place-based sources of heat that would otherwise be uneconomic on the individual scales. And that includes things like geothermal, waste heat, and other low carbon sources such as rivers. Just as kind of like an asterisk here too, this can miss out on some of the mid-scale homes who can't really benefit from either air source heat pumps or heat networks. So we as a team also specifically focus on using shallow geothermal through networked ground source heat pumps, in addition to the larger scale heat networks role that geothermal will play. Which we're talking about today. And we expect that both of these systems will play a significant role in decarbonizing heat. Despite widespread adoption, though, in other countries such as the Netherlands, geothermally sourced heat networks have several challenges that have created barriers to its uptake in the UK. So over on the right-hand side of the screen, this shows the different ways that we can actually use geothermal energy for different depths. So we look at everything up until the middle line as a team for context. However, this does create additional complexity because there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. Therefore, there is a requirement for proper investigation to sustainably and safely tap into at the various depths. In other words, it's crucial to involve scientists to map and model the subsurface. Unfortunately, in the UK, the expertise required to do a proper workup is in short supply. Which that has resulted in monopolization and significant cost implications. And so this has either put people off geothermal entirely or meant that they were engaging with ill-equipped, I'll say, companies, or just skipping the subsurface step entirely. Related to this, data availability and access is a significant barrier. So even when you do have the expertise, in the UK, you can find yourself up against things like paywalls, confidentiality agreements, or just even have trouble finding the right person in an organization to speak to. In contrast, places like the Netherlands have a really robust legal requirement for subsurface data to be made open access. And on the financial side, as mentioned, the development expenditure can be significant. And there is currently no funding available in the UK to support this really crucial phase of the project, including risk-sharing schemes like they do have in other countries. Heat network developers can also be put off by the larger capital costs, long payback periods associated with geothermal energy, which is in addition to the cost of the heat network itself. Another significant challenge is that we've identified is the regulatory and legislative landscape. So for example, how many of you are aware that heat is not a regulated resource? When I found that out, I kind of freaked out a little bit. So heat ownership presents a significant risk for developers and investors because there is currently nothing stopping someone drilling a hole literally right next to yours and taking your heat. And while you may be thinking someone would be crazy to do so, there are actually real world examples of poorly managed aquifers that have resulted in the exhaustion of heat sources. So it is really important. And all of these things really contribute to a lot of uncertainty and a significant risk profile. So what can we actually do about it? So in this context, can local solutions unlock geothermal energy in the UK? And that is where, heat network zones could potentially help bring this to fruition. So for those of you that aren't aware of heat network zoning, it is new legislation that is coming in place in England across England in 2025. And what this will mean is that within these zones, certain types of buildings will actually be mandated to connect to a heat network once it's actually in place. And what this will do is create guaranteed customer base and what we call an anchor load, which will actually help make that network viable. And the black dots, for context, on the map represent the 28 pilot cities across the country. So how these zones are designated is basically there is some quite complex technical analysis behind the scenes that is identifying areas where heat networks are the lowest cost way of decarbonizing heat. And this is based on an optimization model with air source heat pumps as the counterfactual. The idea is that once a zone is identified, that zone will then be passed on to what's called a local zoning coordinator, and we're assuming that this is going to be somebody within a local council for implementation. The challenge with that, though, is that our research suggests that the fact that in many urban environments, there is a real lack of heat sources, and that will act as a significant barrier. So as a result, what we expect to happen is basically the zones won't be implemented, which would be a real shame. So how can we actually create the conditions for heat network zones to be implemented? So nice thing is DESNAs, who Emma mentioned earlier, are actually very open and welcome research into subsurface energy, storage, and recharge, as well as other sources like water and sewer to kind of incorporate into the model, because that's not currently taken into account. So how can we make sure that heat network zoning doesn't just become another policy on the shelf? And that is where our team really comes in. So we're working on some really exciting projects that bring together the social science and geoscience to really explore how we can make geothermally sourced heat networks happen at scale across the UK. So on this map, you can actually see all the potential heat network zones within the Leeds metropolitan area. And we are looking at 3 distinct case studies within Leeds, which are highlighted in red, to understand both the subsurface and surface conditions and chart a path for how we can actually, or for how these heat zones can be made viable and how geothermal energy can actually support their implementation. So it's within this. So project 1, as Emma mentioned earlier, is Leeds Pipes. So within Leeds, we actually have an existing heat network within the city centre, which has been spearheaded by Leeds City Council. And the network supplies a range of buildings, which on this map you can see potentially little tiny green buildings. That includes things like social housing blocks, the museum, council buildings, and several commercial buildings. And the existing network is the kind of bluish red line that goes across the top of that map. And currently, it is supplied by the RRF, which is an energy from waste facility, as well as backup gas boilers. And as you can imagine, burning waste is not very low carbon, but also the facility itself has a finite lifespan. So new energy sources are needed to support the expansion, decarbonization, and also the long-term sustainability of that network. So there are actually plans, for example, in the south to expand that network, which is that kind of pinkish line at the bottom left-hand side of the map. But the challenge is that Leeds has a particular problem with lack of heat sources, which makes geothermal a particularly appealing proposition. And because this is an area of high energy use, and it's covering quite a significant area for the city, in this zone, we're looking specifically at deeper geothermal, so depths below 750 meters. So kind of for the second half of our project, we're looking at areas that don't currently have an existing heat network, but we expect to be designated as a heat network zone. So for starters, we have Zone 19. So this is a new settlement in the northeast of Leeds, and it's a largely undeveloped area, although there are some small pockets that have already been consented. In this middle area, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but the orange colors are actually areas that have been approved, have received planning permission with gas boilers, so not great. So we really want to figure out how we can potentially change that over to geothermal. The great thing about this area is that it is primarily new build and also residential. And with new builds come better building standards and lower temperatures. So for this area, we're looking at an ambient fifth generation heat network, thanks to that lower temperature demand. So we're looking at specifically shallow geothermal or depths of up to 300 meters. And just to also point out, as an aside, this little tiny square in that top corner, that is actually a council-owned growing facility with a huge heat demand, which actually the zoning model did not capture. So worth noting that. And then for zone 23, which is the zone on the right-hand side, this is an existing settlement in the south of Leeds, in the Morley area, if any of you are familiar with Leeds. And because this area is predominantly older buildings, there is that higher temperature requirement, not necessarily in the same way as the city center. And it also doesn't have the same density as zone 1. But on the plus side, there is the potential to connect to larger anchor loads, so existing larger anchor loads as well, because there are clusters of commercial buildings like leisure centers with pool, schools, grocery stores, that kind of thing. So that gives us a really nice base load for a heat network if it were implemented tomorrow. This area also has a legacy of mine workings. So we're looking at potential for mine water heat. And you can actually see the old mine workings on the map in that kind of light purple color. And actually all the red circles are old mine entries. So there's quite a lot of legacy activity in this area. Just also to point out, similar to zone 19, there are also areas of large development that the model hasn't picked up. So those are the hashed areas in the top and also that blue area towards the bottom that again just haven't been included in the zoning model as it currently stands. So what are we doing about all of this? How are we going to use this data? As Arka mentioned and as Emma mentioned, Mo, our geoscientist, is actually working on building on the data gathered and developing an energy model for Leeds. And then on the social science side, David Barnes and I are working on mapping and developing an understanding of the zone characteristics. And as part of this, we're engaging with a range of local and regional stakeholders to explore the key decision factors when it comes to planning and delivering heat networks and geothermal energy. And we're also engaging with DESNZ to explore how to best support geothermal in heat network zoning. From a local policy impact perspective, we're actually developing a series of scenario reports for these 3 areas for Leeds City Council to support future decision-making around geothermal in heat networks. And that includes things like energy availability, temperature and depth profiles, costs, benefits, risks, as well as other energy options, as well as developing and exploring development pathways. And to support them in this, we're also looking at developing local policies or supporting them to develop local policies and plans that will actually help them deliver a net zero trajectory, whilst also supporting the expansion and long-term sustainability of the existing network Leeds pipes. We're also helping them to prepare for the opportunities and challenges of heat network zoning. And then from a wider policy perspective, there are 55 similar large energy from waste-fired heat networks in the UK. And even more pressing, there are 14,000 heat networks, which are currently mostly fired by gas across the country with an urgent need to transition. So the UK government is really supportive of the growth of new and expanded low carbon heat networks. And our findings will really help them provide that clarity on what's actually needed for the expansion of geothermally sourced heat networks in support of the UK's net zero ambitions. So yeah, I will pass back to Emma.
So very briefly for me, because I appreciate time is probably short. So as you can see, like this is a taste of what we're doing at Leeds, and it's really important to recognise that whilst you know some of the stuff we're doing. So, for example, the campus test site is very locally based. Our plans for our research is to make the opportunity to answer questions that actually can be passed on to wider understandings, both from aquifer behaviour, management of reservoir behaviour, etc., across multiple aquifers, but also multiple depths. So, for example, looking at the aquifer go much deeper down to Sheffield or etc. But also understanding societal, if we can really focus what we're doing on Leeds and understand what happens in the environment in Leeds, that also projects into other urban environments across the UK. And as such, we think it's really important to break down research silos, and it's something we're working very hard to do at Leeds. As you can see, we've got some word clouds here of what our questions are. So the subsurface questions, you can see heat is right up there, and the above surface questions, heat, use, policy, regulation, how do we manage it? These words, you know, they're popping up on both sides of it. And actually, to be able to really deal with those questions, we have to come together. We can't solve problems quickly in the speed that we need to in working in our own research silos and industry silos, etc. We need everyone to work together. And hopefully we're looking to try and present that in the way we work at Leeds. So just as a last slide, just to tell you a bit about the wider group at Leeds. So we have a Geothermal Leeds research group. It's a cross-faculty group of around 30 academics. So that's the academic staff. Behind that, we've got an ever-growing number of postdocs, including Arca and Jess, and PhD students as well. So it's a big group, and it's made up of lots of geoscientists, engineers, and that's from the civil engineering end all the way through to people who are dealing with corrosion in geothermal systems. We've got social sciences of all different types of social scientists, and political to sort of like understanding energy networks and circular economy of energies and in sustainability teams. So there's a lot of different people all working together on these problems, which makes it really exciting for us, to be honest. And there's some examples of projects, and these are by no means all the projects we're doing at the moment. So, you know, things like seismic monitoring, fluid flow stress testing, high energy geothermal. So we work in places like Iceland and the East African Rift Valley and places like that as well, looking at high energy geothermal, but also things like Paola's project looking at food, growing food in the urban environment with vertical farming incorporated with geothermal energy. So there's lots and lots going on at Leeds, and hopefully this gives you a taste. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, Arca and Jessica. That was a fantastic and very comprehensive talk covering several different angles of the actual exploration. It's fantastic to see. And of course, I saw quite a few leapfrog models in there, which, being from Sequent, I loved.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have got a part in this, Ollie. You're yeah, exactly. So you do have a part in it.
So, I mean, while obviously time is quite tight, but we can continue on for, if that's okay with you guys, for 5 to 10 minutes or so to see if any questions pop up that anyone really wants to ask. But I mean, it was really interesting to see sort of all the various angles. I guess the one main question about sharing data, are you guys planning to present this at the, I think it's the 11th Geothermal Symposium down in London in November?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. We've got an abstract submitted.
Yeah. So potentially multiple abstracts.
Yeah.
We're
working on other ones.
Because at the moment for us, it's like we're getting like a lot of data coming in now, and it's just working through it and working out what to do with it. We have plans of what to do with it, but yeah. So yes, we've got plans to share a lot of this in November. Yeah.
That's good to hear. And I also know that many other countries have set up geothermal kind of databases, national databases that people, for anyone can access. I don't actually know. Do we have one in the UK, or is that still, shakes heads? Yeah, I feel like that's something that we particularly need to work on in the UK, really.
Yeah, we have multiple areas to go to. I know British Geological Survey are working hard to try and bring it all together, but there's still complexities. Like, well, yes, you can go to the BGS repository and you can find all the boreholes. But a lot of them are confidential. So do you know, there's loads of boreholes in Leeds. I mean, for instance, just outside the university campus in the middle of Hyde Park, there's a potentially reasonably deep borehole that could give us information, valuable information, but it was drilled about 100 years ago by the post office. So we have to find someone in the post office to get permission to use it, right? So BGS have the data, but they can't legally release it to us until they've got permission from the owner. So we actually had to get permission from our university to release our well data via the BGS to us. So, you know, it's a process that, you know, we've got potentially the time to keep at it in academia, but it's certainly not something that people in industry, and, you know, let's move out of industry, let's move to businesses, local councils, who really, we think local councils putting in big district heat networks for deeper geothermal may be a better solution, that actually have local councils even got the knowledge to find all this data, and know where to go, know what to ask for, then know how to use it, pay the money for some specialists to come in. So some of our aims are to actually make these models that we build, make what we're doing more accessible, so it can be put into, you know, initial feasibility studies to allow companies just to assess the economic value of the geothermal, to allow them to assess whether they can even afford it. So yeah.
And I think the fact that you guys approach it also from all angles, including the social sciences, and actually addressing the policies, because I think we tend to either look at it as geoscientists separately, but we all know geothermal has been affected by various concerns coming from drilling and, you know, microseismic and, well, not microseismic, but actual seismic events coming from that. I mean, how is it drilling? How has been your kind of campaign to inform? Did you inform local people what you were doing, or at least the university, that you were going to be drilling these boreholes for geothermal heat, or was it just done through the council and there was no sort of public awareness about it, or how was that done?
So I mean, it's a big part of our project, to be honest, has been working with, who knew we had so many communications departments at the university, but we have a lot, and we've been working together with all of them. So that's something that David is particularly focused on, is understanding firstly how we communicate, because when we first got together there was lots of, so the social scientists would be like, let's engage everybody, there's climate this and climate that coming up, let's engage the students, and we'd all go, but somebody might ask us about fracking, and how do we deal with that? And so it's been a really interesting sort of guiding each other to meet somewhere in the middle, where we're, as geoscientists, a little less scared, and the social scientists that have more understanding of why we would be worried. And actually, some of the aspects that we've been having meeting with students, and we also gave them the opportunity, staff and students, to ask questions. So they have a QR code on the drill site that they can access and put in their questions, and we can respond to them. But what we're doing is making a note of all those questions, understanding what good responses would be to them, so that we can disseminate that out to out to the wider geoscience community and geothermal community to better build those communications, so we do it well rather than poorly. Yeah.
That's great news. There's one person here firstly asking, are you able to share the actual presentation in the future, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. I think, because Ollie, aren't you working at getting these presentations made available anyway? So we've worked on the assumption they're going to be available.
Okay, that's good to know. And we got a question. So from Alex Connolly, how much data from the BGS Geoenergy observatories is available to use as part of the project, and how applicable is the data to other areas? Comparison to the Glasgow coal measures and the lead coals measures comes to mind. Who wants to answer that?
So in our campus project, we don't actually hit many of the coal measures. When we do, they're very thin seams, and they're not laterally continuous over the entire campus. So we've seen bits of coal in some of the core as it's come out. So looking at the coal measures per se wasn't a large part of the campus project. I'm not quite sure how well it would interface with, say, the results from UK Geos in Glasgow. I know a lot of the data from the Glasgow Observatory is publicly available, and it sort of gives like a template for how eventually we make the sort of time series data from our sort of monitoring available. It sort of gives us the rubric. There's no current plan as such where our site acts as an observatory in the same vein as UK Geos.
Yeah, I would say, however, I was at a 3-day workshop with Mike Spence, who runs the Cheshire Geo Observatory last week, and we had a lot of conversation about how we can overlap some of the, because whilst they're in different geology, some of the questions are the same. And I think management of heat is really high up there. So it's certainly something we're having conversations with BGS and Mike and others about, how we can overlap the questions we have with potential data from those sites. So not immediately, because we've got so much to deal with locally, but in the long term, I think that, you know, as with all the other things that are going on in the UK across academia, etc., we can link a lot of those things together to answer questions better.
Excellent, excellent. So might get a reply written back. If you look at the chat, actually, there's lots of
coming through.
High praise from everybody. They were saying fantastic talk. I think we might have to end it though, because I'm sure people are probably waiting to go for lunch and things like that.
Yes.
But again, thank you very much for delivering that talk. It was a fascinating talk, and I look forward. I'm actually going to share it to quite a few of my colleagues as well. And you know, for everyone else, I hope you join us next month for our Wednesdays in Wing. As always, if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, please do. It gives you all the interesting things going on in the UK regarding Wing. And, you know, please do join us next time. And thank you again to you three as well. So,
yeah,
cheers.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.